So we're doing a lot of work around DNA. We've been taking a look at what is DNA, how does DNA work in your cell, how does DNA help you get the traits that you do, and it's time to move on to something a little bit different. We've been talking about all of this, but ultimately we've been talking about it to lead to the point where we can understand reproduction. And to begin understanding reproduction, we need to understand, first of all, how do cells reproduce? One thing I've mentioned a few times is that every single thing, every living thing started as a single cell. So that means you were a single cell. I was once a single cell. Sorry about hitting my mic. Your parents were single cells. Their grandparents were single cells. Plants were single cells. All of these things were single cells. But now they're made of like trillions. Like I'm made out of like 50 trillion-ish cells. So how did that happen? Well, it happened because of one process. See, that process is called mitosis. And in order to understand mitosis, let's actually think for a moment about what this word means. The ending osis always means action. So it refers to some process that is going to take place. And here's the weird part. Mito, the root word of this, means thread. So you gotta kind of understand a little bit about history for a moment. Keep in mind when people first looked under the microscope and saw mitosis, what they saw looked like the action of threads. But we have a little bit better understanding of what's going to happen here, and that is that those threads, big long strands inside of cells, are DNA. So what they were really looking at was DNA, and they were looking at the action of it. They only saw this action at specific times, and those were times when the cell was copying itself. So we know now that mitosis is the action of one cell dividing to make two cells. And so that is ultimately what mitosis is. It is the dividing of cells. Now, there's actually more than one way that something can divide, so it's a very specific type of division. And in order to understand this, let's think about when we would actually see mitosis. So we see mitosis when one cell makes an identical copy. So why would a living thing need to make an identical copy? Well, remember I said you start as a single cell? You end up becoming something that's like 50 trillion or so cells. You have to grow in order to do that. And that is one of the major times that you end up seeing mitosis is through the process of growth. You also end up seeing mitosis when something needs to replace cells that have been damaged. So when you get a cut on your skin, that cut doesn't just stay forever, it eventually fills back in. And how does it fill back in? Well, it fills back in with cells. And those cells had to come from somewhere. And so they came through the process of mitosis. The other thing that we end up seeing is sometimes cells wear out. A great example is your skin. Right now you've been washing your hands like 8,000 times a day and they're all flaky and dry. Why? Well, the reason why is you're washing a whole bunch of oil off your skin, and as that happens, the cells on the top of your skin start to dry out and eventually they die, and you are actually coated with a layer of dead cells. That's what the outside of your skin actually is. This has to be replaced. You have to get those cells back. And so at the base layer of your skin, cells are dividing and constantly pushing upwards until they die and leave that dead layer on the top. So when do we see mitosis? It happens when things are growing, when things are healing, and when things are replacing old cells. So this is what mitosis is. It's the division of cells to make an identical copy. And this is when we see it. What we should probably also understand here is what we end up getting from this. We get, from mitosis, two cells. Each have identical DNA. So since you were initially made of one cell, and that one cell grew through the process of mitosis into you, that means that every cell in your body has the exact same DNA. So all of your cells have the exact same set of instructions. And it's those instructions that allow your cells to function in the way that they do. You see, this is the way that growth and healing and the replacing of cells works, is it really just allows those cells to be replaced with an identical version. Now, the other thing we should understand about mitosis is that some organisms actually use mitosis to reproduce. This may seem weird to you because it's not how we reproduce, but it's a really, really common method of reproduction. You see, some organisms will just make a copy, and then they will grow that copy into its own individual organism. This is what we would call asexual reproduction. So the process of asexual reproduction is when an organism can produce offspring that has the exact same DNA as the parent. So the parent and offspring are actually genetically identical. So for the most part, this happens through mitosis. I should clarify here, this isn't always the case for asexual reproduction, but for the most part, it is. Specifically, mitosis also only happens in eukaryotic organisms. That means organisms that have membrane-bound organelles and a nucleus. So bacteria, prokaryotic things, actually have their own method of asexual reproduction and cell division. But right now we're focused on eukaryotic things, so we're taking a look at using mitosis as the way of going through asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction actually only requires a single parent because that parent is going to copy its cells through mitosis and produce offspring that are genetically unique. So imagine I could asexually reproduce. I know that's super weird to think about, but basically it means that I could use parts of myself to make new cells that would eventually grow into an exact genetic copy of Mr. Sander, which is super weird. Don't want that to happen, but that would be what it's like. And this isn't so uncommon. You may think, oh, that doesn't happen very much, but it actually happens a ton. Asexual reproduction is happening all over the place in all sorts of organisms. It can happen in plants and fungi and some animals too. And so it's just one way that life has found to evolve and survive on this planet, is using this as a reproduction method. Now, in order to understand mitosis, we really need to understand the life cycle of the cell. And so the life cycle of any cell can really be broken down into what we call the cell cycle. You see, the cell cycle is exactly what it sounds like. This is the life cycle of a cell, and it's essentially broken down into 4 different phases. Now, I've drawn these phases to look as if they are the same time frame, but they really aren't the same time frame. You see, it starts in this point. Really, you can think of, since it's a cycle, there is no start, there is no end, but let's pretend this is like part 1 of the cell cycle. And it is what we call gap 1. Gap 1 is really just the cell doing its thing. It's the cell hanging out, performing its functions. If it's a kidney cell, it's being a kidney cell. If it's a brain cell, it's being a brain cell. If it's a liver cell, it's being a liver cell. It's just doing its job, really. While it's doing its job, it's also gaining energy, it's storing some nutrients, it's, living its life. And that leads us to the next stage, which is called S phase, or synthesis. You see, during synthesis, the cell is actually going to copy its DNA. So it's going to go through the process of replication, where that DNA is going to make an exact copy of itself. And this is going to be really important because if a cell is going to reproduce, the new cell that's made needs to have DNA. And that DNA is going to come from the parent cell. So it's going to be used as a template to provide DNA to the offspring cell. Then the next phase is what's called G2, or gap 2. Gap 2 is really just, again, the cell kind of doing its thing, but during gap 2, it spends a lot of that time storing energy. You see, it's about to replicate, and replication is a very energy intensive process, like any reproduction is. So you're starting with a single cell and dividing it into two, that needs a lot of energy. So the cell is going to make sure it stores it up for that time. These three stages, gap one, synthesis, and gap two, are all called interphase. So interphase is really where the cell spends most of its life. It does its job, replicates its DNA, and then just does its job and stores energy. And that is the major part of what the cell does, is spend its life in interphase. But for a very small portion of its life, it's going to go through mitosis. And mitosis is going to be this process of taking that duplicated DNA, dividing it, and creating a brand new cell. So this part of the cell cycle, mitosis, itself is actually broken down even more. So just like interphase took place in a series of different steps, there was G1, S, and G2, mitosis also takes place in different phases. And so we're going to go through what those different phases are and try to understand what's happening in each of those phases and how that ultimately leads to the creation of a new cell. So, phase number one. Phase number one is a phase that's called prophase, and it's characterized by two major events. You see, it's when the chromosomes form and when the nucleus dissolves. So to understand what's going to happen here, we need a cell. So this is going to be my cell membrane, the outer part of that cell, and I need some chromosomes. So inside, I'm going to make my chromosomes red. So you used to have these strands of DNA, and all of those strands of DNA existed protected inside of the nucleus. But what's happening at this phase of mitosis is that we no longer have individual strands of DNA, but we now have chromosomes. Now keep in mind that the DNA has already been duplicated. So we form chromosomes that have that like butterfly appearance. Each half is a single strand of DNA. The other major event that's going to take place is the nucleus is actually going to start disappearing, and by the end of this phase is going to be gone. So it's kind of important to understand why. I think in biology we spend a lot of time memorizing processes and don't think about the reason. So remember, we've divided or we've duplicated our DNA in the S phase of interphase. And the reason why was to divide and make two new cells. Now, the nucleus is going to disappear because you need to then distribute that DNA into separate membranes. So that membrane is eventually going to close off and create two new cells. And so the DNA needs to be split amongst those cells in order to do that. But as soon as the nucleus goes away, the DNA is now exposed to all of the chemicals inside of the cytoplasm. And the DNA, remember, is the instructions on how to run a cell. And if those instructions get messed up, so does that cell. So it's really important that this cell is actually able to function properly and the DNA is protected. So as the nucleus goes away, the DNA forms chromosomes to bunch up and protect itself from the rest of the cellular environment. Remember when I called this the action of threads, and that's what mitosis actually means? Well, those threads are the chromosomes. That's what people saw under the microscope, and it's the only time you see chromosomes under the microscope because it's the only time the DNA leaves the nucleus. So that's actually where we get the name for this process. That leads us to phase two. So during phase two, we now have these chromosomes that are free away from the nucleus, and they now need to be divided. So that duplicated DNA that was formed is now going to find a way to end up actually being split apart. But in order to do that properly, the cell needs to organize itself. And that's what's going to happen next is metaphase. During metaphase, this is marked by one major event, and that is when the chromosomes line themselves up in the center of the cell. So again, we're going to draw our cell. So we have our cell membrane that has not gone away. We have our chromosomes, but now the chromosomes have organized themselves in a line. So you're going to have chromosomes all lined up right down the center of the cell. And so it looks a little bit something like this. There is another thing that's going to take place, and that has to do with what are called spindle fibers. You see, things can't just like move randomly in the cell. Something has to move them around. And so the cell attaches kind of like a little rail system that the chromosomes are going to be able to slide across. And it attaches right in the center of the chromosomes. That's what's called the centromere. And you have these big, long, essentially like strands that stick to the centromere of each chromosome. That is what happens during metaphase. So now that our chromosomes are organized, they're lined up down the center, remember each side of that chromosome represents a single strand of DNA. So now all you really need to do is tear that chromosome in half, pull those chromosomes to opposite sides, and now you have two sets of DNA on opposite sides of the cell. It sounds like a pretty good start to being able to divide. This next phase is called anaphase. So anaphase is really marked by this one major event, and that is those chromosomes being split apart and pulled to opposite sides of the cell. So to see what this is going to look like, we need our cell membrane back. And then inside of our cell membrane, we used to have those chromosomes lined up down the center, but now those butterfly structures are actually going to be ripped apart from each other. And so you end up with single strands of DNA that now move to opposite sides of the cell. Remember, the whole process of mitosis is to try and set it up so that the cell is able to divide itself into two. So the spindle fibers are actually going to allow that track for the chromosomes to be pulled apart. This process is now separating the DNA so that you have the same DNA, because of that duplication process in S phase, divided to opposite sides of the cell. So now we're really close. We have separated the DNA. We have the instructions to build cells actually separated from each other. And now all we need to do is cut it down the middle. We actually just need to divide this cell into two. And this is going to happen differently depending on if you have animal or if you have plant cells. Plant cells will grow a plate down the center, and animal cells will pinch in through a process that creates what's called a cleavage furrow. But this next phase is called telophase. So during telophase, you actually get the process of this cell pinching in the center. Assuming we're talking about an animal cell, if you had a plant cell, it would actually grow a plate down the center in order to replace the cell wall that needed to exist between the two cells. But we actually also have our chromosomes on opposite sides of this pinching in. This pinching in and eventual division process has its own name, and that name is cytokinesis. Cyto means cell, so we're talking about cells, and kinesis means movement. And so cytokinesis is essentially the movement of two cells apart from each other. And that's really what happens during telophase, right at the end, to split those two cells apart. Now, there is something else that has to happen in order for this cell to get back to normal. The chromosomes have to unfurl and turn back into strands of DNA. The other thing that needs to happen is as they do that, they need to become protected again, so the nucleus reforms. And this is really what's happening during the process of telophase, is the final division into two separate cells. This whole process is what we call mitosis. Prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, and finally cytokinesis, dividing into two separate cells, is how cells cause organisms to grow, to heal, to asexually reproduce, and replace cells that eventually wear out. This is a really ancient process, and we know that because it's used in every eukaryotic organism. It's so successful at division that it had to have evolved to become common amongst all eukaryotic things. And this process, it actually makes sense when you start to understand the biological mechanisms and the reasons why things are doing what they are. So I hope this helps you understand the process of mitosis and helps us lead to our next division, which we call meiosis. And that's going to be coming up in my next video. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.